All right. Hello again, everybody. I hope we're doing well today. Um, so, here's this nifty map um, of ethics, generally speaking. And recall that last time we were focused on actions, right? We were focused on targeting the rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, right? And we talked about we talked about utilitarianism and consequentialism. And that's a moral theory that identifies what? That identifies the consequence or outcome of an action as the right or wrong making feature of the action, right? So why is it wrong to murder? Well, it's wrong to murder because most of the time it's a very bad outcome. Okay, so we're going to shift into from outcome-based moral reasoning to rule-based moral reasoning, right? So we're going to be focused on Kant, doing the right thing, respect and universal law, right? We're going to be focused on rules, right? So this is a common way of thinking about morality. We do it all the time. We say that somebody broke the moral rule, right? And so this will help articulate some of the things that we might mean when we're talking about moral rules. All right. So this is like a nifty hint here. So Call of Duty, we've all heard of Call of Duty, right? Well, we're going to be talking about Immanuel Kant today. And Kant is all about duties, right? He's all about framing morality in terms of rules, right? And he's all about framing morality in terms of duties that always have to be followed, right? So when you think of Kant, when you think of deontology, think about Call of Duty, right? These are people who are just following their duty, right? Their obligation. Kant is telling us the same thing about morality, right? That we ought to follow our moral duty no matter what, right? Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. Okay, so just general deontological thinking, right? So rule-oriented moral reasoning, kind of generally speaking, we are not thinking about the outcomes, right? We are thinking about the rules and the intentions of the individual making various decisions, right? We're not thinking about the kind of good that's going to come from an action. We are just thinking about whether or not that action is right. So where consequentialism prioritizes the good over the right, where the right is defined by the good, deontology reverses these, right? It says that the right will defines in some sense the good, right? The right, doing the right thing, acting in accordance with the rules, that's our goal, not trying to bring about good outcomes. Okay. And we can think about like rule-based moral reasoning in terms of the First Amendment, right? Why would a government either appreciate or give its citizens the right to the freedom of speech? Well, on utilitarianism and consequentialism, those rights are either given or appreciated insofar as they bring about good outcomes for everybody, right? They're necessary for a good society, right? A healthy society. We want that outcome, so we give the freedom of speech, we give or appreciate the freedom of speech in order to bring about those outcomes. Now, by contrast, deontology and rule-based moral theories are going to say, well, in order to respect people's autonomy and rationality, right, we are obligated to appreciate or give people the right to the freedom of speech, right? And so we see that different moral theories are going to give us different reasons for implementing the same policies. That's the point here. Okay, so Kant as an example of moral rules. Okay, so Kant wants to talk a whole lot about willing and the good will. So, what is willing? Well, willing is the cognitive process of action, right? So, the idea here is that we all desire all kinds of stuff, and we do actions that change the world some way in order to make it the way that we want, right? So, for example, if I want a drink of water, what do? Well, I take my cup, right? I take my cup here, and I go inside and I turn on the faucet, and then I turn off the faucet and I drink water. So, willing, therefore, is identifying the desires that we have and then creating action plans that achieve those desired ends. So me and my thinking, right? We've already thought about all this stuff, but my action plan is to take the glass that I have, go inside, turn on the sink and fill it up with water and then drink, right? And so that whole process is an act of the will, right? Okay, so the good will, right? So we can distinguish between good and bad wills. The good will is the will that is in accordance with, either perfectly or partially, in accordance with the moral rules, right? So doing the right thing for the right reasons. That's kind of the abbreviated version of it. So according to Kant, we want to be people with good wills. How do we do that? Well, we do that by knowing and understanding what the moral rules are and then aligning our will and our desires to those ends. So consider an example. So let's try and figure out who has the better will. Consider Scrooge or Scrooge McDuck, right? Scrooge hates people. He really doesn't like people. He wants to be alone, right? Scrooge is also really, really greedy, and he doesn't like sharing his wealth with other people, right? He hates people, hates giving them money, right? Uh, and he likes to keep and hoard his money and be alone. Pretty bad guy, right? Okay, well, he still gives to charity, even though he doesn't want to give to charity, even though he doesn't desire to give to charity. He knows that he has to. Well, why does he know that? Well, because it's a moral rule to give to charity, right? It's morally right to give to people who are less fortunate than you, right? So even though he loves his money so much and he hates people, he does the right thing in spite of his own desires, right? Now let's contrast this with a second person. Uh, so when, at least I know when I was in high school, I'm sure when you were in high school too, I did lots of volunteer work. You know, volunteer at an animal shelter, volunteering at a food pantry, all of these kinds of things, right? Uh, but I was very quick to put those community service hours on my college application, right? Or on my resume, or all these things. So the idea here, and maybe you did that too, the idea here is that, okay, we're all doing the right thing, right? However, we don't seem to be doing it for the right reasons. Well, why? Well, because we're getting some kind of advantage in virtue of doing the morally right thing to do, like helping at an animal shelter, right? We are all receiving some kind of award or some kind of benefit in virtue of doing the right thing. Okay, so here's the question. Who has the better will? Scrooge or us, right? Who are getting things out of doing the right thing? It seems like Scrooge does. Why? Well, because even though he hates other people, and even though he loves his money so much, he's still doing the right thing in spite of himself. Whereas with us, if there were no benefit to doing the right thing, right, to the community service and whatnot, even if there were no benefit, we might not actually do those things. So it seems like Scrooge has the better will, right? Seems like Scrooge has his will more aligned with the good will. Okay, so let's distinguish between two different imperatives or kinds of imperatives or rules, right? So two different kinds of rules. We can talk about hypothetical imperatives on the one hand. We can talk about categorical imperatives on the other hand. Hypothetical imperatives are commands of reason, right? Okay. That are in some way contingent on our own desires and our own goals. So, for example, let's say that you want to go to medical school. Maybe you do want to go to medical school, right? There are a number of different things that you have to do in order to go to medical school. Okay, lots of different things. One of the things that you have to do to go to medical school is take organic chemistry, right? Most medical schools, or all of them potentially, require all of their students to have had organic chemistry. Okay, so if you desire to go to medical school, it thereby becomes a kind of rule for you to take and pass organic chemistry. Now, let's say that you decided not to take organic chemistry, yet still desire to go to medical school. You would be acting irrationally on this definition of hypothetical imperatives. Well, why? Well, because organic chemistry is a requirement for getting into medical school. You can't get there without taking organic chemistry. And so it's irrational not to take organic chemistry and desire to go to medical school. Okay, so the idea here is that hypothetical imperatives are contingent upon our um, our own desires and our own ends, right? Okay, by contrast, categorical imperatives are commands of reason that are independent of what we desire. Uh, they tell us what we should do no matter what, right? So, regardless of what we want or what we intend to do, we have to follow this imperative or these imperatives or this kind of rule. Okay. So Kant wants to say that morality should be framed around the categorical imperative as opposed to hypothetical imperatives. So this is a nifty distinction for talking about rules, because when we talk about rules or imperatives, we could be talking about either categorical imperatives or hypothetical imperatives. So we want to limit or restrain morality to the categorical imperative. All right, so let's chat a little bit more about the categorical imperative. Okay, so Kant gives us two very nifty formulas for talking about talking about how we can figure out what's morally right and what's morally wrong. The first formulation of the categorical imperative, right, is the formula of universal law. Okay, so we want to figure out. So here's what the first formulation of the categorical imperative is. This is a nifty little summary right here. One sentence. Act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it become universal law. right? So what the heck does that mean? Okay, well, we need to chat about a couple of things. So universal laws are the rules of morality, right? So it's a universal law that is, according to this moral theory, that is wrong to kill someone, right, without a reason. Um, it is wrong to lie to someone else. These are universal laws. Um, so that's the idea here. We follow universal laws in order to act morally right. Okay, so what's a maxim? A maxim is a kind of rule um, that we have whenever we act. So every action has behind it a kind of rule or principle of the action. Okay, um, and it's based on the situation, and it's based on why we're acting the way that we are, right? Okay, so the formulation of universal law is all this right here. It's these 4 steps right here at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so the first thing we do, we identify the action. Okay, we want to act in a certain way, and we want to figure out whether or not it's right or wrong, whether we can do it. Kant says we just follow this formula and we'll get right to it. So let's take up an example action, a modern example action. Let's say that I want to use somebody else's Netflix account for free, right? We all do it. We all do it. I do it sometimes, or I do it all the time. So I want to use somebody else's Netflix account and not pay for the account, right? I want to use Netflix for free. Okay, so I've identified the action. That's the first step. That's the thing that I want to do. Now I have to figure out what the maxim or the rule of action behind the action is, right? Okay, so whenever I don't want to pay for Netflix, I will borrow somebody else's Netflix, right? That's a kind of moral principle or a kind of rule that I am presently following by doing my action. So whenever I don't want to pay for Netflix, I will borrow somebody else's Netflix account. Okay, now for the kicker here. Can the maxim be universalized? Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, we pretend, right? We think, okay, what if our maxim were a universal law? That is, what if our maxim were a law that everybody had to follow? What would that world look like, right? So let's suppose that it becomes a universal law that whenever you don't want to pay for Netflix, you just borrow somebody else's Netflix. Suppose everybody had to follow that rule, right? Was obligated to follow that rule. Well, there's a problem that comes up. It can't consistently be universalized because on that rule, nobody would actually buy a Netflix account, right? And so there would be nobody else to borrow the account from, right? Nobody would actually have the first account that we could all borrow from because we'd all be trying to borrow somebody else's Netflix. So the idea here is that, look, we can't consistently universalize this particular maxim. Why? Well, because we can't, because we would never actually be able to implement it, right? We'd never actually be able to follow it because there would be nobody to actually buy the first Netflix account. Okay, so let's think about a second one, right? So this particular action failed at maxim 3, right? So the action is immoral because everybody can't consistently follow it. Okay, let's do a little bit different, a little bit more extreme example. Suppose it's in my interest to murder someone. And so I say, oh, okay, should I murder this person who it's in my interest to murder? Okay, so identify the action. I'm going to murder this person. Identify the maxim, which is when it's in my interest to murder someone, I will murder them. Okay, we could say, can this maxim be universalized? Well, in a world, well, let's suppose that becomes the rule, the universal law. Everybody has to follow it, right? Perhaps it's not always in everybody's interest to murder other people, right? There probably would be more murders in that world, but it seems like we can consistently universalize that principle or that maxim. There's no kind of internal tension in the principle. There's no kind of contradiction in the maxim itself, right? We could all follow that rule, right? Okay, so potentially it passes this third step. Then we have to run it into this fourth step, right? And we have to ask, would a rational person want to live in a world where your maxim is universalized? The idea here is that, okay, we have our maxim. Whenever it's in my interest to murder someone, I will murder someone. That's a rule, and everybody follows it. Would you really want to live in that world where everybody followed that rule? Well, potentially no, because it might mean that you are the person that's going to get murdered, right? Would a rational individual, somebody who's just thinking soundly, who has their own interests understood, would that person want to live in this world? Potentially not, right? And we could debate about that, but potentially no. And so if that's right, if a rational person would not want to live in that world, then it fails the test right here. And so it is immoral to murder someone when it's in your interest. So you can see how it works. So if we could identify a maxim that passes these two steps, well, then it follows that it is a moral duty, right? It is okay to do, and it's morally just fine. So we could say something like giving to the poor. So should I give to the poor? Well, I give to the poor because I know that they don't have as much as I do, right? So potentially everybody could consistently hold that maxim. And a rational person would probably want to live in that world where everybody followed that maxim. Well, then it's probably a moral duty to give to the poor. That's the idea here. So we can, for any action, we can run it through this test, and that will tell us whether it's morally right or morally wrong, at least according to Kant. Okay, so I've already given a couple of example tests, but Kant gives us some example tests too. So he talks about lying about a loan that you don't plan on repaying, right? So I don't have any money. I go to the bank. I say, hey, I'll give you your money back. Just give me some money. But I have my fingers crossed, like behind my back, right? I'm not actually going to pay it back. That seems wrong, right? That's a lie. So first of all, we identify, should I lie about paying back the loan? All right, then we identify the maxim, which Kant gives us. When I think of myself in want of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know that I never can do so, right? So I'm going to make a promise that I'm not going to fulfill. So we can ask, well, why can't we universalize this? Or can we universalize this? The answer is no, right? And the answer is no, because it destroys what a promise is, right? So making a promise is committing yourself to doing something even when it's not in your interest to do that thing, right? And so when you promise someone with the intention on not following through with that promise, well, that you're just destroying what it is to be a promise. So we can't consistently universalize this maxim. That's the idea here. All right, and then Kant gives several other examples as well. Um, and I'm not going to go through with each of these examples, but we can talk about duties to self, duties to others, right? So we can have moral obligations to ourselves. We can have moral obligations to our other people, or to other people. And that's an intuitive distinction. However, Kant also distinguishes between perfect and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are duties that we always have to follow, right? So, um, so for example, not murdering someone, that's a duty, presumably. I always have to follow that. I can never murder someone, right? So long as I'm not murdering someone, I'm doing the right thing, right? So this is something that I have to follow all the time. Kant talks about the example of suicide. You always have to refrain from committing suicide. Uh, this is something that you always have to do. By contrast, imperfect duties are duties that you fulfill only some of the time. This is because there are not enough, you may not have enough time or enough money to fulfill these duties at every point in time, right? So, one of the imperfect duties to ourselves that Kant talks about is refining our talents, right? So, do we want to just sit around and eat Cheetos all day on the couch? Or should we be practicing, right? Should we be developing ourselves in some way, learning how to play an instrument, say, or reading literature that we've never read before? All of these things, right? Should we in some way cultivate or develop ourselves? Kant wants to say, yeah, we should do that, but we have a duty to do that, but only imperfectly, because we can't spend every waking hour uh, working on our talents, right, or refining ourselves in some way. So we have an obligation to do it, but only some of the time, because we have finite amounts of time, right? We have other things to do, right? We're busy people. And then an imperfect duty to others is giving to the poor. And the idea here is that, look, we can't always give to the poor, because eventually we'll run out of money and we will be poor ourselves. So we have to give to the poor. We're obligated to do that, but only some of the time. Okay, and so Kant gives us a second formulation of humanity, right? So the second formulation of the categorical imperative, right? So he gives us, look, categorical imperative is one way with the universal law formula, right? And it's also this other way too. So we can run an action through either of these, and most of the time we'll get the same result. So the second formulation of the categorical imperative. So act as to treat humanity, whether you're yourself or whether that of other people, in every case at the same time as an end, and never only as a means. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, this is the formula of humanity, right? So we got to wonder about using something as a means to an end and treating something as an end in itself. There's a key distinction for a lot of philosophy. So it's really important. So we treat things as a means to an end all the time. So why do I have this glass right here, right? Well, I have this glass because I need to drink water, right? This glass is merely a means for me to have water, right? To be able to hold water with me and so that I can drink. Okay, so suppose that this glass breaks and it can no longer hold water, right? I'm going to get rid of it. Well, why would I get rid of it? Well, I would get rid of it because it can no longer do the thing that I need it to do, right? Namely, hold water for me. Um, so I'm treating this glass as a means to an end, a means to drink water, right? That's the valuable thing, is drinking water. This glass is just a vehicle for me to get that end. Okay. So look around your room right now, wherever you are. There are all kinds of things that you treat as a only as a means, right? There are lots of things that you only have because they have a certain function, right? They achieve ends, right? Uh, but Kant thinks that humans are not that way, right? We can't treat a human like we do a glass, right? We have to treat humans or rational creatures, right? Maybe there are Klingons or aliens or something, right? We won't go there, but rational creatures as ends in themselves, right? So the idea here is that, look, I can't treat a human being like I treat this cup, right? I can't have a human being like, on a chain and I snap my fingers and then all of a sudden they give me water, right? Like that's wrong, because humans have autonomy and rationality, right? They share these two pivotal characteristics that make them in some way beyond a mere means, right? So you and we are in a relationship where you are kind of in some way using me as a means to get this course credit, right? Um, well, that is true, right? But you can, even though we have this kind of relationship, right? This dynamic. Um, you can treat me in such a way that still respects my humanity, even though um, I am a means to an end, right? And so the idea here is that in all of these cases, all of these examples that Kant talks about, right, you are either treating yourself or treating others as a mere means, not as an end in themselves or end in yourself. So, for example, in the promise case, the loan debt case, um, we might say that in virtue of lying to the person that's going to give you the loan, you are treating that person as a mere means, as a means only to an end, right? You're treating them like an ATM machine. You're like objectifying them. And that's a problem. That's a problem for Kant, right? Because you need to respect this person because they have rationality and because they have autonomy. When you lie to them like that, you are in some way disrespecting their autonomy, because you're giving them a belief that's not true that they are going to then act upon, right? And that's not fair to that person. You're not treating them as an end in themselves and appreciating their autonomy and their rationality. Okay, so let's raise an objection to Kant. So according to Kant, you always have to refrain from lying, right? It's always bad to lie. So consider the following case. It's Nazi Germany. You're a German person, and you have Jews in your attic, right? You're hiding Jews from the Holocaust. Okay, one day you hear a knock on the door, and there's a couple of SS officers that look at you and they say, "Hi, do you have any Jews in your attic?" And you don't know what to do, right? You don't know what to do because you're a Kantian, and you know that you're not allowed to lie ever, 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 ever. okay, because you're going to be treating the SS officer as a mere means, not as an end in themselves, right? Maybe you can't universalize that this particular maxim. So, do you lie or do you tell the truth, right? Uh, it seems like we should lie because if you tell the truth, what's likely going to happen is that they're going to get the Jews out of your attic and kill them or take them to the Holocaust, to the concentration camps. So if we have rules that can't be bent to some degree, that seems like a major problem. So I'm just going to leave that there, and we can think about maybe in a journal response or something about how to defend deontology from this objection. All right, thanks.